Welcome to the 11th video in the Just In Case series sponsored by Quality Equality, an OD consultancy firm based in Oxford, United Kingdom. And my name is Mei-An Chung Judge, the director of the firm. We chose the name Just In Case is because just in case you need reminding of something, just in case you did not know, just in case you want to refresh your memory about something, and just in case you want to know a topic better. In our recent global research on use of self, Professor Jamieson and I found that being an internal practitioner, they face a lot more external and internal challenges in order for them to stay optimal in their use of self. So today we invited back Professor Bob Marshak to share with all the internal practitioner that what are some of the things they need to put in practice in order to stay effective. Bob need no introduction, but I love to remind you that he is one of the leading OD thinker about organization, consulting, and change. Bob started his career in OD as an interno. In this video, he shares helpful insights about how to stay effective and be a trusted collaborator with senior management. Please listen to his wisdom and reflect on the richness of his presentation and how you as an internal can review your approach up to this moment and see what else you can do for you to become optimal in your use of self. Bob, thank you so much for being willing to come back to share your wisdom. And I'm sure everybody are looking forward to hear what you have to say. So over to you, Bob.
Hello, I'm Bob Marshak, and today I'd like to talk to you about being an internal OD consultant. A little bit about my background to talk about that. My original intended career, back when I was much younger than I am now, was the public service in the United States government. I had been inspired, as many people of my generation, by our President John Kennedy to serve in the government and to be the best and the brightest, or at least that was our intention. I had gotten a degree in public administration from American University, and I had been offered a job in government service by somebody who'd been a classmate of mine and was running an internal management improvement staff, and I was hired as a management analyst to do expert studies in a scientific agency in the government. Initially, the work that I did was very well received. People thought it was quite excellent, but nothing happened. As is typical with many management studies, it ended up on bookshelves and things like that. Initially, I thought it was because of my young age. I was in my middle 20s. Most of the people I dealt with were 20 to 30 years older than me. Everybody that was a manager in that agency had a PhD in a hard science. At that time, I had a master's degree. I began studying in part-time in my doctoral studies a whole new field called organization development, and began learning ideas from that about how to be effective in organizational change. And I began to incorporate those things into what I did. And that made a tremendous difference. And so things became not only well done, but also things began to happen in a different way. That was noticed by senior leadership, and I began getting rapid promotions to work on higher and higher and more difficult and more complex projects involving anything that had to do with policy, management, or organization, which were topics that I had expertise in, but they did not. They had expertise in biological and physical sciences. And so I was rapidly promoted eventually into senior executive positions in science policy. I left after 9 years. I had had enough of reorganizations and policy studies, and I wanted to continue being a consultant, and they were moving me ever so gradually and then not so gradually into high-level administrative positions in the government, which at one time was what I wanted, but was no longer what it was. So I eventually left. That's kind of a background. It was an agency of 3,000 PhD scientists. And it was, again, an expert culture for sure. And I was quite different than everybody there. Most of them came from the United States Midwest and had doctorates in agricultural sciences. I grew up 20 miles outside of New York City and had no background in agriculture whatsoever. I had one course in biology, and I grew up in a suburban development that 20 years before that had been a potato farm. That was the extent of my background. And the big joke in the agency, as I began to be more and more higher level positions, the way they would tease me and put me in my place would be to say, Marshak thinks milk comes from the supermarket. So that was the background. But I'd like to talk to you about what I learned in that kind of a background about doing OD and about what I thought helped me to be very effective and to work on very high level projects at a very, very young age. So I think I will start with that and we'll see where we go. So let me give you some tips about being an effective internal OD consultant. And I'm going to go quickly through what the ones I'm going to cover are, and then I'll go specifically into it. One of the things you'll notice on the list is none of them have to do with knowledge of OD techniques, knowledge of OD interventions, or things like that. Those were important to me, but the differentiators for me were other factors that positioned me to be effective. So for me, those included contracting is critical, the importance of ensuring confidentiality, the criticality of building trust with the people I dealt with, that I needed to establish and protect my reputation. I needed to develop and exercise political acumen. I needed to think organizationally. I understood I needed to work for my clients, not my functional home. And I needed to proactively set expectations about me and my role. And so let me give you some examples and explain each one of those. The first one I would like to talk about is the importance of contracting. One of the things that, of course, you learn very early on in organization development processes is the importance of contracting with clients about what you're going to do. That I understood conceptually, but here I was a middle-level, low-level management analyst in an expert culture where the norms of that organization, as in most were, that I was on staff, and some instruction would come down from some high-level administrator to go do a study of X unit or X process or Y policy or something like that. And that was it. That was your instruction. You went off. You were supposed to know what an expert study was and what to do. And you would send back a written report of your findings with recommendations, and that was it. And of course, you would never see the client because they were a high-level person and you weren't. And things would go up the chain of command and down the chain of command and whatever. Well, that was, of course, how I operated initially, but not how you're supposed to operate in organization development. Now, without ever telling anybody I was doing organization development, because this was the early 70s in the United States where that term organization development really hadn't come into play and did not exist. And of course, I was a management analyst. But furthermore, in that time, in the atmosphere of the United States, OD meant drug overdose. So if I said I did OD or I OD'd, that meant a very different thing. So I learned never to use the term organization development. So I knew from my studies I wanted to do contracting. I also knew that that was something staff did not do. Nonetheless, I told my director who had hired me and was intrigued by organization development and was very supportive. So he pushed his boss about letting me go see the last project that came down, which came from the associate administrator of the agency, that's the number 2 person, on a project. And I said, I want to go talk to the associate administrator and contract about what he wants done. And oh no, we don't do that here. Oh no, Bob, no. You don't, just here, here's your project. Just go do it. You do good work. It's fine. Just go. I said, but how do I know I'm going to do what he really wants done? Bob, you know better than anybody else what needs to be done. Just go do it. And I said, no, I really need to talk to him. Would you push? So I was being humored. And so my boss pushed his boss, who pushed. And eventually one day I ended up in the associate administrator's office at headquarters. And I think they were humoring me. because they thought maybe I had some potential. I don't know. I was 30 years younger than the person sitting across the table from me. And I was asked, why I was there. And I said, well, I'm here because I understand that you want some work done on whatever assignment it was at the time. I never used the term contracting. I said, what I want to do is spend just a short amount of time. I want to make sure that what I do is what you want done, and that I do it the way you want it done, and I do it appropriately and whatever else. Well, there was a certain logic to that, and I was already in the office, and so we had a discussion about what was wanted and how to do it and what was involved. I also, on the spur of the moment, because I'm a little bit of a clever guy sometimes, maybe to a fault, I said, could I ask you my Santa Claus question? And of course that got a smile, and he said, what's your Santa Claus question? I said, well, if you got on this project exactly what you wanted in terms of what was done, how it was done, what impact it had, who it involved, if there was a written report or not, and how long or how short, what would it be? If Santa Claus came to you and gave you the best thing that you could ever ask for, what would it be? So the comment was, well, let me tell you, I want to make sure that these bases are touched. I don't want to get anybody upset. I don't need a long written report. What I really need, and so it was all laid out. So I left saying, okay, can I get back to you if I have any issues or questions? Yes, of course you can. So I went out and I did pretty much exactly what I now knew needed to be done, and that was it. From that point on, because I had delivered, and they really liked now what I delivered, they understood that Bob Marshak, when he did his work in that organization, he was going to come to the office of the person commissioning it and have a discussion about what was wanted. No other staff in that organization, as far as I knew, ever did that, because they operated under the model that staff did what they were told, and you didn't go ask questions because that was bothering the higher ups and you were a staff person. And furthermore, if you had to ask them, that meant you didn't know what you were supposed to do, so obviously you weren't an expert, and this was a scientific agency where showing expertise was important. So I became unlike other staff, and I could get away with it because I established that precedent by what I did and how I did it. That's a little bit about contracting. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the importance of ensuring confidentiality. I think that's a well-known principle in organization development. As an internal, there's some extra pressure that's put on you in ways that are different than if you're external. As an internal person, you're hearing things directly related to what you're working on. You're hearing things in hallways, you're hearing other kinds of things, you're talking to people who are revealing confidences to you or whatever else. There can be a temptation to use that information selectively to advantage what you're trying to do because it's a source of power. And internal people usually don't have as much power as they'd like to have. And so if I dib a little bit of information here, or I whisper a little bit there, or something like that, I might be able to have some influence in the moment. I avoided that totally, because as soon as you do it once, you're trapped into doing it. So ensuring confidentiality became important, and like other things that I began to do, was not the norm. So early on, there was a project that I was on as we started to do things that were more organization development related. And there was a team building project where I was working with an external learning how to do team building. And people were interviewed, and we were collecting quotations and theming them for data feedback, which is a pretty standard intervention, especially at that time, data feedback, but had never been done in that organization ever. And so now there were all these quotes about people commenting about it, and it was incredibly powerful in that moment. But some of that information was captured and shared with higher ups in the organization, almost like, hey, did you know that so-and-so said this about such and such? So one day I'm called by my boss's boss, who was the number 3 person in the organization and ran all administrative functions, to come to the office. And my boss said, this is not good. And so we got in a car and we drove off to headquarters. And we went into the office, and my boss's boss pulls out some of these quotes and says, I want to know who said this. And I said, well, I can't tell you that. That's confidential. And I get this look like, what do you mean you can't tell me what that is? Uh, do you know who I am? I said, of course I do. I know who you are. You know. I said, but I can't tell you. And he said, well, I'm asking you what it is. I mean, it's you do work for me, and you know, I know you're only here not very long, but you know, you don't have to stay here very long either. And I said, but I can't tell you because it's confidential. And I got this message that was sort of like, Bob, I think you really need to think over what you're saying. At that point, my boss stepped in and said, let's take a break, which I learned is one of the great interventions in life is let's take a break. And we walked out in the hallway and my boss said, just, would you wait here a minute? And it went inside and had a discussion with his boss. And I was invited back in and I did I don't mean to be disrespectful, and I should have said something early on about the importance of confidentiality, and I apologize if somehow that came across the wrong way. And of course, what I got back was sort of like, well, I understand you're trying to be very professional, Bob, and it would have been helpful if you had told me initially, so we were both saving, obviously, face, and I was worried about his the most. So I stayed on, and I learned that back in those contracting meetings, I needed to tell people the information I got would be totally confidential, and that was how I operated. And anything we said in this meeting was also confidential. And so again, I had established a precedent that confidentiality was important. I was never asked ever again by anybody in that organization to reveal confidential information, because they also had, the story of that, of course, gets out. And it was that I had stood up to, a powerful person who at an early point in my career, and therefore I stood for something, and that I could somehow be involved in that. And that leads me to the next subject, which is trust. And so let me talk a little bit about the importance of trust. It became critical in my career that people began to trust not only that I would do a professional job, or not only that I knew somewhat what I was doing, or I like to believe I did, or that they could trust if I said something would take 3 weeks, it took 3 weeks, or whatever else, or I would stay within budget, or they could trust me in terms of my character. They could trust me in terms of I would not reveal confidences. They could trust my ability to do something. And that became really important in this organization because I was moving around in different parts of the organization, talking to all sorts of people who were telling me things that they were not telling other people, which was building up what I knew, but also they had to trust that I would not blab it out to anybody else and be quiet. I once got a very important assignment as I had moved on, that involved tens of millions of dollars in scientific programs and where they were going to be administered. And there were some political directives that where it had been administered, it needed to be found a new organizational home for a variety of stakeholder reasons and things like that. So I was commissioned to be a central person in managing a project to take a look at where it might be located differently. And I dutifully said, okay, I'll do it. I don't like it. I'd rather not do this project because it's politically loaded. They said, that's okay, Bob, you'll handle yourself. So I went off to the head of the person who ran those programs, who of course was all the reasons why they should stay where they were and not be moved or whatever else. And I said, I know, I wanted to come down, I wanted your background before I did anything. You do understand that the administrator of the organization has been ordered by the secretary, who reports to the president, that we are going to do this, and I need to do this. And it was so like, yeah, I do understand. I said, well, thank you very much, and I'll try and keep you informed as we work on this. And I got up and I'm walking out of the person's office, and they said, Bob, wait a minute. And I turned and looked at him, and they said, I'm glad that it's you. I'm glad that you're involved in this, because I know you will be fair, and I know you will call it like you see it and not just tell them what they want to hear. And that was gold. That was basically, might not like what came out of it, but trusted me as a person. So my character was being vouched for by what I had done. I had never met this person before, so clearly it was out there or whatever. And over time, I began to realize that the trust that senior people put in me, uh, which didn't have to do with how good I could facilitate a team building meeting, but had to do with how I operated in that organization, was the most important thing, more than tools, more than techniques. And so I began to incorporate that not only as an internal when I met new people, but when I started my career as an independent consultant, and I'd be called in by people and they would interview me, and invariably you get the question, why should we hire you? And then you're supposed to tell them all the projects you've worked on and what you know and all your expertise. But I always added, for the rest of my career, from that day forward, I always added with a new client, and I would say, and I think you need to hire the person that you trust. Because for the work we're going to do or that you want done, trust is critical. You have to trust the person. I don't care why you trust them or for whatever reason. Certainly credentials in other ways are important, but you need to hire the person you trust and move on from there. And so I would get work often. Sometimes I didn't. I never explained why. And I don't really know if that was the critical factor or not. But for me, it was. Trust with senior people, especially in my mind as an internal in an organization, if they having trust in you is the most single important thing you can do to move forward. That, of course, leads into the next thing I want to talk about, which is your reputation. One of the things that I began to think about as I began getting this notion that people were trusting me was I began to realize that I had a reputation. Everybody has a reputation if you do anything of any importance. So people were forming opinions of me, opinions about how I operated, opinions about what I knew, opinions about whether they could trust me, opinions about how I would deliver, and hopefully they were favorable opinions. So people knew me before I arrived, and I could tell that by how they operated. They didn't quite say, well, you don't look like I thought you would, or you don't talk the way I thought you would, but there was something about the way they operated that was important. And so for me, the most important credential was my reputation. So when I showed up, I didn't have to say, oh, I'm Bob Marshak and I work for this organization and I do OD and you should whatever. I had a reputation that if I was involved in a project, it would go better than if I wasn't. They couldn't explain what I did because I was doing process stuff or why it worked that way. But that was part of it. And I had a reputation as calling it like I saw it, which in that culture meant scientific objectivity, I guess. But I was not influenced by having to give the right answer or whatever else it was. And one of the ways I established that was I needed to be able to, in important meetings, when I had my bosses in those same meetings, and I was asked to do something that people knew the bosses wanted done, I could say no. And I did. Now, I had to do that judiciously. I had to do that wisely. I had to do that in advance. I had learned from my little encounter about confidentiality that letting people know that I might say no was a wise thing to do. But my ability to say no in certain settings, when I was getting pressure to do things, established my reputation as somebody to be dealt with, as somebody to be respected in certain ways, because it wasn't a no like a petulant no, it was a no for a reason or whatever else. And it was something about protecting my integrity and protecting who I was and how I worked, and that what people could count on me was terribly important. The next item that I would like to talk about is developing political acumen. Now, one of the things I know from many years of being around OD consultants, internals, externals, or whatever, and being a professor of OD and so teaching people over time is there's a lot of antipathy about politics and organization development, power and politics. So when I talk about political acumen, I'm not speaking about acting politically or wielding great power. What I'm talking about is being savvy about the politics of the organization. So I began to notice, develop, and understand who had power, formally and informally, how power was exercised, where decisions were made, how things were carried out, what the pet peeves of people were, what were the pressures on them from political sources, and what was involved. And every project that I worked on, I would see these dynamics played out about how meetings were run and who came to the meetings and how they were carried out. And I would file them away. So I began to understand on the work that I did what the internal power configuration was. I also began to understand, because I was in a public agency, what the external pressures were from stakeholders and executive branch powers coming down from the president in our system, coming from legislative people who controlled our budgets, coming from lobby groups, coming from the press, coming from scientific circles. And so I began to understand the politics of anything that I did or any project that I worked on. That allowed me, when I was in contracting meetings, to begin to factor that in the discussions of what was involved. And it began to design processes and ways of consultation that accounted for that. Do you think we need to involve this group? Do you think we need to bring in these kinds of people? What about what's going to come up over here? How do we handle the fact that the secretary is opposed to that, but we really want to deal with that? And we could talk about that. And one of the things that was, of course, happening was, first of all, staff didn't have these discussions because they were not in these contracting meetings to begin with. And second of all, most of the staff, their orientation was to get the project and give the answer they thought was the best answer, and then the administrator was supposed to carry it out. Well, the administrator, of course, would get something that had nothing to do with the pressures that administrators were under from political sources inside and outside of the organization. And so they felt a little bit hamstrung or whatever else. And so here I was, this young kid, talking to them about all these political factors that they understood. And we could talk about how we were going to deal with them. Well, of course, what did that do? That elevated me. That moved me up in terms of being able to be more of a partner in how we talked about stuff and what they could rely on me. And importantly, they could rely on the fact that I would not be asking them to do something that was incredibly politically dangerous, either internal or external, because I was not aware of it. Now, having done that, had several important factors. One, it made me more credible. Two, it made me more of a trusted advisor. Three, it signaled to them that I was ready to be promoted because I understood the politics of the organization. One of the things I had to be careful of, though, is the more I worked on higher and higher level projects, the more I was trusted more and more, the more I knew about how things operated, the more power I had, because I had insights about how things were done. So I had to be very careful about what I did in terms of being truthful, in terms of having integrity, in terms of not using that power in a way to advantage myself or people that they thought I was involved. So it was an interesting way to have to operate that eventually led to my ending my public service career. The last major project I worked on was a humongous reorganization of the entire sector I was in under pressure to downsize, which was going on at that time. So I was part of a project where we were ordered to get rid of thousands of jobs, and so a whole bunch of us were part of this process. And we in essence took out the middle of the organization before that was fashionable. And one of the things we did, everybody who worked on this project made sure that what went in was a concept of the organization that flattened it, could get rid of the number of jobs we were mandated to get rid of without touching scientists, which was one of our mandates. And every one of us that was part of that project, our jobs were being abolished. Every one of us. What went in was we were all, because we had to be integrity. Now, an interesting thing is because this was a scientific agency, and it was like, oh, well, if that's what you think is right, okay. And so my job was abolished. And so I went out and became an independent consultant. Anyway, an interesting way to have to operate. The next thing I want to talk about is connected to political acumen, is to think organizationally. Now, at that time in my graduate studies, I had come across a book by James Thompson called Organizations in Action. It was written in 1968. It was one of the great books at that time on organizations as open systems. And as part of what was in that book was a proposal on his part that there were three types of thinking or three types of rationality in organization. One type was technical rationality, which was a way of thinking about what was the right way to do something and the most expeditious and whatever else. And that tended to be done by people who were close to the work, and so they would come back with this is what makes most sense. Another type of rationality was what was called institutional or organizational rationality. That tended to be done by high-level people who were running the organization, and it had to do with what is rational for the survival of the organization. Yes, it's nice to know that that's the technical right answer, but I got to deal with politics and I got to deal with something else. So what's the way to think that will keep us surviving as an organization? And the third type of rationality was one where you understood both of these types of rationality and you could kind of work them both. Again, most of the staff in my organization had technical rationality. That's what they were being supported in, and so they came back with the best answer. That's in fact what I was hired to do as a management analyst, come back with the right technical answer, which then was not implemented because it was not the correct organizational answer given the politics and given the factors of what was going on in the history. So I began to think about projects and consult with people and to work projects in ways that recognize the organizational rationality. So now when I dealt with people at high levels, I was operating with political acumen and organizational rationality, which became more and more someone that high-level people could talk to with letting out whatever they needed to be said, because I was someone in the room who actually understood these things and I could add information or ways of thinking or question it. So it was another way to get me more involved. And at this point in my career, I began to only do projects for the administrator of the organization. So at the very highest level, our interfaces with high-level outside people. That brings me to another part that was important for me, and that had to do with who did I work for. Early on, one of the things I learned, my staff, which was then called the Management Improvement Staff, was equal to what was then called the Personnel Division, which is Human Resources now. We were equal leveled. There were 15 people in my organization and probably 55 in the other, or 155 in the other. When I would go out on projects, because I was in projects that involved with people would say, do you work for the personnel department? And I would say, no. And I could see that there was a difference in that reaction. And I didn't understand it because I was young and new. And I went back and I talked to people. I said, what is that all about? And they said, well, Bob, you got to understand, the personnel department here, they review whether or not somebody is at the right grade level. They review grievances, whatever else. They kind of have this sort of police enforcement function. And so people don't know if it's safe to talk to you because they think you're from a function that might be able to do something to them. And then when you tell them that you're not, there is a certain level of relief. So for me, it's sort of like, ooh, wait a minute. I'm going to have not only my reputation, but there's the reputation of the organization that I work for. And so now I have to pay attention to that. And so I began to operate in ways like, yes, I work for the Management Improvement Staff, which over time we renamed the Organization and Management Development Staff as we shifted more into OD type functioning. Yes, that's where I work. But I also began to develop a way of operating that was signaled by my behavior, that I was more like an independent consultant who was housed in an organizational unit. And so the more I operated that way, the more effective I could be, because people did not think I had an agenda associated to where I was housed or the agenda of my boss, which again goes back to why it was important for my ability to say no at certain times, again, judiciously, not cavalierly. I will say, having done that for myself, but also over the years working with many internals in many different organizations, the people who were internal OD people, who I saw as being the most effective, the most powerful, if I can use that term, all had positioned themselves to be more or less like an independent consultant housed in an organization unit. And so they were very influential. The unit that they were part of became influential. but they were not seen as a captive of that unit, but they were seen as being somebody who was conveniently housed there, but would operate ethically, independently, and whatever else. The final thing I want to talk about is one of the things I find for a number of people who are starting out is they are hopeful that they have the title OD consultant or something like that as an internal, and that everybody they work for will know what that means. After all, it's a job that's there, and they've been called into the staff, and so they'll show up, and people are supposed to understand what you do as an OD person. And of course, that isn't true. They don't understand what it is, or they think they understand. It isn't quite right. And so, of course, I had the advantage if I couldn't use the term OD, and I never did. You need to go in my mind, set expectations by what you do and how you act. You have to assume, and I always assume, that no one ever knew what I was really doing. And again, they never did. It was always put Bob on the project, you get a better result. We don't know what he does. It's all this strange mumbo jumbo, but it's effective. And I never tried to explain it to them. Or if I did, I talked in everyday language. It's like when I went in, I never say I'm doing contracting. I went in and said, I'm here because we're going to be more effective if I know what's on your mind and we have a little back and forth or whatever. And I avoided OD speak, and I avoided name-dropping books, and I avoided theory. Now, by that time, I had picked up a PhD part-time, so I knew lots of theories and lots of books and lots of whatever. And the fact that I had a PhD was very highly respected in an organization of PhD scientists, even though mine was in the social sciences. But I tried to use everyday language. I tried to not make it mystical or anything else. What they cared about was whether or not I could be effective and whether or not they could get the results they wanted. They were not necessarily wanting to be educated in what OD is and why they should think that's wonderful or anything else. So I was able to, most importantly, reframe their expectations of what a staff person did. I've said this now for a number of times in this talk, but the expectation of me was that I could do the work, that I could handle myself with people who were at higher grade levels and whatever else, that I was trustworthy, confidential, professional, knew what was going on, but did not use it to advantage myself or my friends. That for them was good staff work. Bad staff work was what they got from almost everybody else, which is where people would come in and give their expert answers and act like the administrator should salute them and carry out what they want without really understanding what was necessary. But that expectation of me, which is really what OD people do, is you have to set it yourself. You have to do it by what you say, by how you act, and what you do. And that becomes critical in terms of what all is involved. So that's 8 things to deal with. I know it's been a lot. Digest it for a moment, and I'll wrap it up. So let me summarize here, going over what I said, actions for effective internal practice. There are 4 things that have to do with positioning yourself in the organization. And you notice that I've talked a lot about the importance of that. Contracting and recontracting has certain benefits for the work you're doing, but it begins to position you as someone that does that, begins to position you as an equal or a partner in the change or whatever. Confidentiality positions you as somebody who can be trustworthy and that they can deal with. Position yourself to build on that and maintain trust at all costs. I would never consciously do anything that I thought would threaten my reputation or threaten people's sense of trust in me, and establish and protecting your reputation. Things about positioning yourself. In terms of engaging the client, that you're now positioned, you now show up in the client. In addition to what you know about organization development, it's your ability to understand the politics of internal and external, your ability to understand organizationally, what's the history of the organization, the culture of the organization, what's going on, the pressures on senior executives, some project that blew up a couple of weeks ago, things that are coming down from higher levels in in the politics of the executive branch of government. Your ability to position and engage the client by putting their interests first and their agenda first, and no pushback in that, and they could trust that and they could see that in how you operate. And your ability to do all this by not expecting them to know it, but by consciously projecting that out in terms of expectations and what's needed in their language and by your actions. So that's a quick summary, and I hope that's helpful. I don't really have a whole lot more to add. I think I've probably gone on way too long already. But I think there's a sense here of there's a sense of values and ethics in terms of internally who you are. And again, I think what you're hearing from me is probably under the terminology use of self or projection of your character. That's the most important thing you have as an external and an internal. Knowing all the tools and techniques and theories and everything is terribly important. But in the business of working with other people, where they have to rely on you and where you're trying to build a relationship that allows you to be more of a partner rather than a subservient order taker, your ability to create your persona and carry that out becomes critical. And in my mind, as an internal, one of the things that differentiated me from some of the other people I worked with was my ability to do the things I've talked about. So I do want people to go out and be terribly proficient in theories and techniques and technologies of OD. But I also want people to go out and perhaps carry out some of the things I'm talking about to be more effective in the service of better functioning organizations and the people that you work with. Thank you very much, and good luck to everybody. It's been nice to spend a little time with you today, and I hope you've gotten something out of this.
On behalf of everyone, can I say a big thank you to you, Bob, for sharing your thoughts and experience on this amazing insight of how to stay effective as an internal OD practitioner. I particularly love the story you tell because they bring to life those important lessons. And thank you for reminding us the importance of holding our integrity, increasing our trust, and be a true collaborator to those people we serve. And so I hope all of you who've been watching this will be able to take a lot of insights away and also find times to discuss with your friends and colleagues at work. And if you'd like to contact Bob to continue this conversation, his email and other information and the article he published in this area are listed there. So, Bob, thank you again. And for the rest of you, stay safe, stay well, and continue your good work in wherever you are. Goodbye.